The fourth Hermetic principle is polarity. Everything is dual. Everything has poles. Everything has its pair of opposites. Like and unlike are the same. Opposites are identical in nature, but different in degree. The classic Hermetic example is temperature. Hot and cold are not two separate substances added to an object. They are the same phenomenon, molecular motion, differing only in degree. Push cold far enough and it becomes hot. There is no wall between them, only a spectrum. The Kabbalists mapped an entire moral and cosmic architecture onto exactly this insight, and they did it with the two sephirot most often discussed as a pair, Chesed and Gevurah, kindness, expansiveness, unconditional giving on one side, and Gevurah, restraint, judgment, boundary, discipline on the other. These are described in the Zohar and in later Kabbalistic ethical literature, Mussar, not as one good force and one bad force, but as two necessary forces that only produce a livable world in combination. Chesed without Gevurah is not virtue, it is a flood. Indulgence without limit, giving that overwhelms and destroys precisely because it lacks boundary. This is, in fact, the Kabbalistic reading of the actual flood of Noah, the world of unrestrained expansion with no counterbalancing judgment, which had to be reset. Gevurah without chesed, meanwhile, is not righteousness, it is cruelty, judgment with no warmth, restriction for its own sake. The sephirah that resolves the tension between them, tiferet, usually translated as beauty or harmony, is not a third force competing with the other two. It is the synthesis, the golden mean, the point at which kindness is disciplined enough to be wise, and judgment is warm enough to be just. This is polarity almost exactly as the Hermetic principle describes it. Two poles of a single spectrum, identical in nature but different in degree. And the wisdom lies not in choosing one pole permanently over the other, but in knowing when the moment calls for expansion and when it calls for restraint. The Rambam, or Maimonides, writing in an entirely different register, legal and philosophical rather than mystical, in the Mishneh Torah's Laws of Character Traits, arrives at essentially the same structural conclusion without any of the sephirotic vocabulary. He describes the ideal human character as the middle path, or the kind of golden mean between excess and deficiency in every trait, not the coward, not the reckless, but the courageous, not the miser, not the spendthrift, but the generous in right measure. Rambam was a rationalist, deeply suspicious of the mystical tradition in some of its more speculative reaches, and yet he lands on structurally the same claim as the Zohar. Virtue is not a fixed point at one pole. It is a dynamic balance between two poles that are, in some sense, made of the same underlying stuff. The Talmud itself gives us one of the most famous illustrations of polarity functioning at the level of law and argument rather than personal character. The schools of Hillel and Shammai disagreed on an enormous number of legal questions. Shammai's school, generally the more strict, more Gevurah oriented. Hillel's school, generally more lenient, more chesed oriented. A heavenly voice, according to the Talmud in Tractate Eruvin, declared that both these and these are the words of the living God. Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim, even though the practical law ultimately follows Hillel. Two contradictory positions, both called true, both called divine speech. That is polarity functioning as actual jurisprudence, the tradition holding that opposing forces are not a scandal to be resolved by declaring one side simply wrong, but a genuine feature of how truth operates at the level of applied law, where competing values, mercy and justice, leniency and rigor, must be held in productive tension rather than collapsed into a single flat answer. There is a deeper theological layer here too, worth stating plainly, because it touches something people often struggle with, the problem of evil. If Gevurah, restriction, severity, judgment, and in its most extreme unbalanced form, what the Kabbalists call din, running unchecked, is one of the two fundamental poles of divine expression, rather than an alien intrusion into an otherwise purely good creation, then severity and hardship are not evidence that something has gone wrong with God's plan. They are the necessary cold half of a spectrum whose hot half is boundless kindness. This does not make suffering pleasant, and the tradition never asks you to pretend that it does, but it reframes the architecture. Judgment is not the opposite of a good God. It is one of the two hands of a good God, and the tradition's entire ethical project, especially in the Mussar and Hasidic literature, is training a human being to use both hands wisely at the right moment, rather than living permanently gripped by only one. Practically, this gives you something to actually use, not merely something to admire intellectually. The next time you are deciding whether to extend mercy or hold a boundary with a child, an employee, yourself even, you are not choosing between the good option and the bad option. You are choosing which pole the moment calls for, the way you choose whether a situation calls for warmth or for cold water. Wisdom, on this account, is not permanent kindness or permanent severity. It is calibration. In the next episode, we're going to discuss the principle of rhythm, the Hermetic teaching that everything flows out and in like a pendulum, and its expression in the Jewish calendar in terms of Shabbat, Shemitah, Yovel, and the long historical rhythm of exile and return.